is March 11, 2017. I am Vinicio Cinta and I'm conducting an interview for the Voces Oral History Project. We are with Norma Sosa in Ontario, California. And like I said earlier, please feel free to stop at any time if you need to take a break. Or if you don't want to answer a specific specific question, just let me know and we'll move on.
Okay.
Thank you. So we'd like to start talking about your background in journalism. Why did you become a journalist?
I used to read the newspaper with my father. He loved newspapers. And at the time that I was growing up, there was only one newspaper in Corpus Christi, Texas, my hometown. So from the time I was, as long as I can remember, I mean, I must have been 3 or 4. He died, but when I was a little over 6 years old. But until that time, we used to read the papers in the morning together before he went to work. So I always saw it as something that was important to do in the morning, every day. I forgot that. All through school, after my father died, through elementary school, through junior high school, through high school, I just don't remember ever picking up a newspaper. But when I got to the University of Texas at Austin, I was an undergraduate there. I was in a small program called Plan 2. It was interdisciplinary, so I didn't really have a major. And I remember taking a course in which the professor often referred to a number of national newspapers and even international newspapers. It was an art class that all the Plan 2 students took that year. And I just became fascinated with the different ideas that were loaded into this program that I was taking in Austin, Texas. I could see that they were important. I could see that the opinions that I was hearing for the first time in my life were significant and had an impact on the class that I was taking. And I started to question whether it was they also other opinions than the ones that surrounded me in Texas, in Austin, and in the United States also had an impact on the other courses I was taking. So that's how I got an interest in newspapers. And although I didn't major in them, when I went to graduate school at Stanford a year after I graduated from UT Austin, I went into a public affairs communication program and got a master's. And I'm sure it had to do with that very beginning of, reading a newspaper with my father.
So you mentioned that it was the first time you noticed that your opinions had a significance. So why was that?
Well, when my father and I read our local newspaper, there was almost never any story about a Hispanic lawmaker, because there weren't any. And there were no stories about Hispanic teachers or people of significance in the community because of the office they held or their activities in education or arts or anything else. There was never any coverage in the newspaper. So I kind of started wondering why that was true. Not then, I was too young. I didn't really see all of the possibilities of what the paper could have been. I simply accepted it for what it was, and I recognized it was important, but I wasn't in my own 6-year-old mind thinking what it could be. That came later. It wasn't until I was at UT Austin when I started to see the possibilities of how the media could cover people that looked like me and that were involved in important things. One of the professors I had in Austin was a former attorney who had taken the first education case to the Supreme Court, to the courts. I think it ended up in the Supreme Court. I don't know if he was still involved in it when it did go to the court. But it opened schools in Texas to Hispanic students. And I, that to me was an awakening. Why wasn't I reading about these things in our newspapers? And shouldn't I be?
So in the 60s and early 70s, I mean, and before and after them, but those were years where when there was a lot of activism from the Mexican American community,
Yes.
and there was the Chicano movement. Were you aware of what they were doing? How did you see it?
I was reading the coverage, but it was negative coverage. It was defensive coverage. Nobody really, there was no rounding out of who these people were. They were simply seen as activists who were doing something that was upsetting the white people reading the newspapers. It was very much a one-sided view of the political activities that were then growing among the Chicano activist groups in Texas.
What did you think about the movement?
In the beginning, I think that I was influenced heavily by the Anglo teachers that I respected, and I saw it in a negative way. But gradually, in my community, I started being introduced by Latinos in the school system to people in my community who had made contributions already. I mean, Dr. Hector Garcia was very important in my community and, had, through his own personal activism after World War II, had got a medal winner buried at Arlington National Cemetery who the Texas cemeteries would not accept. So I started to realize how important the media could be in changing things like that, in appealing to the right-thinking Anglos and Hispanics who just weren't picking up on these issues, or who were led, as I had been, to believe that these were scary things and threatening things, and not things that had to change. That these efforts were significant in changing the way that Hispanics were viewed, and newspapers had the power to make that change.
So, for the record, the community and the newspaper you mentioned before, it's Corpus Christi and the local newspaper?
Corpus Christi Caller-Times.
So, do you recall your father commenting on this, on the lack of?
I don't. He was, I think he was doing two things. I think he was trying to make me interested in the world around me. I think that was his biggest goal. But I also think he was trying to strengthen my appreciation of reading. And he saw that as important for how I was doing in school, how well I would do in the future. He really was educating me in his own way.
And what about your peers? And maybe in school, do you remember your peers having opinions on these same issues?
No, I went to Catholic school for for kindergarten and for first and second and part of the third grade, and there was not a lot of activism in that environment. And I don't even remember my school friends talking about anything political. I mean, we were very young, for one thing. But even when I went to public school in the middle of the third grade, I don't remember ever having conversations with my peers. I don't remember teachers ever talking about politics or social events or issues. It just wasn't done. It was this was the 60s, or the 50s and the late 50s and the early 60s.
And what about later on, maybe high school and college? Did you notice? Did you have any direct interaction with people who were involved in it?
I went to Ray High School, which was very white. I mean, I think there were 2 black students in all 3 years that I was there, and very few Hispanics. And I was in the advanced placement courses, so all of my fellow students were white, and their parents were city council members, mayors, big businessmen, They were the wealthier class in the town, and so there was no activism talked about. And I don't even remember them talking about. I don't even remember them talking about Hispanic activism. I don't think that was. I don't think that was a topic of conversation that they even had at home.
And another question I had about your time at UT, did you at any point consider or think about moving to the School of Journalism?
No, I didn't. I'm trying to think of why. It would have been a natural thing for me to do at that time. I think some of it came from the pressure that you feel when you're in Plan 2. There's a course of study that you're expected to follow. There were the minimum requirements, and then you were allowed to branch out. And somehow, when I first went to UT, I wanted that to be the concentration that you're allowed to pursue in Plan 2. I wanted it to be classical Greek, and so I went to classical Greek courses for I think 2 years, and then my mother talked me into converting to something more practical. She didn't see me becoming a Greek professor, so I switched to French. I don't think that pleased her at all, but it was more. At least it was in the Western Hemisphere, and so I became a French major, which I still love. I mean, I travel a lot, when I do, it's in France, and I had friends who lived. I have many friends who lived there for years, and I used to see them during the summers when I was away from school, off of school, and also in my career when I was when I had enough time, comp time or vacation time to pull together to see them for a couple of months at a time. So no, I could have, because I was certainly interested. It wasn't until I went to Stanford in the public affairs communication course of study that I just became a journalist. I mean, after that I couldn't see myself doing anything else. Not teaching French, not going to PhD school for further study in French. Although I loved it, I really saw myself as a journalist with the course of study at Stanford.
Did you ever write for the Daily Texan?
No, I never did.
And so why did you make the decision to go to Stanford?
This is going to sound trivial in a way. One of my roommates at UT Austin was the niece of a professor at Stanford, and we went up one summer together just to visit California, because neither one of us had ever been to California. And I was so impressed with the campus and with the people, friends of hers on the faculty that we met at dinners at her house. And I just thought, I want to be associated with these people. I want to come here, I want to study. Maybe I want to be one of them someday, maybe teach. And I was looking through the course guide one day, and what stuck out for me was the titles of the courses in the communications school. I mean, they were very connected to society. They weren't sort of ivory tower courses, journalists looking down on the world. They were very socially conscious, democratic kinds of courses as they were written in the catalog. And I just made the decision right then and there. And by the way, that turned out to be a very accurate impression on my part, because when I did go to Stanford to the public affairs communication course, one of my professors at the end of class one day said to the students, by the way, I just had a call from a friend who is involved with Cesar Chavez, and they need volunteers to work on a political campaign. That year, there had been a proposition put on the ballot that inhibited the kind of canvassing that volunteer groups could do on behalf of small groups like Cesar Chavez's farm workers. And I raised my hand, as some of my fellow students did, and so we ended up working in the office on First Street in San Jose for Caesar's Group, and I mean, it was a transformative experience after that. And that's because the teachers at Stanford, the professors who were teaching in the public affairs communication course of study, were heavily involved in social affairs. I mean, that was an accurate reading of the way the courses were framed in the catalog.
Okay, so do you remember the name of this professor?
I don't. I can look back at my transcript and maybe come up with it. If I do, I'll let you know.
Oh, thank you. So this is interesting. So this inclusion or this consideration of social issues and in working communications in journalism, how did that? Because I mean, you didn't have a previous training in journalism.
No.
So how was the talk about things like objectivity, for example?
I recognized from my courses that it would be important to honor the traditions and the courses that major news organizations followed in researching and presenting the news. I realized that objectivity was going to be important, but I wasn't there yet. You know, I was still a graduate student, and I believed in what Cesar Chavez was doing, and I signed on to it wholeheartedly. And by the way, got lots of experience that was very valuable to me later in life. I mean, long after I left Stanford, I didn't keep in touch with the Farm Workers Organization or with the organizers who directed what I did, my activities every day, as part of the work against the proposition that everyone considered very unfair. But years later, when I was living in New York, working at the New York Times, I used to go to a restaurant on the Upper East Side that was owned and operated by a Hispanic couple. And one day they said to me, by the way, Cesar Chavez has decided to get involved in his own fundraising activities, and he's coming to New York. He's going to be at our restaurant, and he's looking for volunteers and also financial support for the farm workers. And we told him about you, and he said, well, invite her, and maybe she can speak to the press for me. And so I did. I went, and I helped him out on one of his first fundraising trips to New York. And that was completely coincidental. I mean, I told him I had worked in his First Street office in San Jose years before, and he was fascinated by that. He was fascinated as I was by the just coincidence of coming together again in that way.
Can you tell me about the specific activities that you did for the farm workers?
You know, there was a proposition, I've got it somewhere, probably in my notes somewhere. The proposition prohibited putting things in mailboxes, materials, promotional materials for the farm workers. And, there was I guess they were playing off of a rule that the post office had at that time that, promotional materials couldn't be placed in it except by a mail carrier. And so they put it on a proposition statewide that put penalties on the books for that kind of thing. It was kind of a mail fraud proposition. And it was unfair. I mean, volunteers were leaving materials on porches. They weren't manipulating mail in mailboxes, but it was seen as a way to further curb the kinds of distribution activities that the farm workers relied on to get their message out, because the news media at that time in California, was not presenting the issues in a very fair and balanced way.
And what specific, so you did canvassing? What types of communication activities did you do?
We went out and canvassed on street corners in San Jose and other places. And where there were political campaigns going on in which Hispanics were candidates, we volunteered to support them. We looked at their campaign materials. We helped them devise the materials. And as I said, we handed out promotional material, trying very hard to skirt the issues, that California had put on the ballot, because we didn't want to, rock the cart any more than we had. And that pretty much was all we could do. I mean, we were all students. The lead organizer was an activist, a student activist from Berkeley, but almost all the other volunteers were from Stanford.
About how many or what proportion of the student body in your program were Latino or Latina?
I can only think, well, I think there were 4 of us that I can know for sure. Felix Gutierrez was one of them. He was in the PhD. Jorge Chiment was another. He was in the PhD program. And then there was one who dropped out. I can't remember his name, but Felix or George would remember. We tried really hard to support him and help him with the curriculum, which was very tough. And me, and I can't think of any others in the journalism program and the communications program. There were other Latinos on campus in other programs, but not communication.
Did you collaborate? Did you get together? Was there
Oh yeah, we had a regular group. We played Frisbee in the yard, as often as we could. We went to all of the journalism gatherings. There was a regular volleyball game at the once a week that all of the communication students, white or brown or black, well, there weren't any blacks, would play. And, it was an interesting time at that time in Northern California. A lot of the CEOs of communications and software companies that were just forming lived in the area and opened their homes to students at Stanford. So we used to go up on weekends and play croquet with them on their lawns, and it really did foster close friendships among the journalists in the program, the communication students.
Why were they so welcoming to journalism students? What was the connection? Or
they were what we would all recognize as liberal politically, and they thought it was important for communication students to be the responsible journalists of the future that would cover all the communities in a balanced way, in a fair way.
Another thing I just thought about. You mentioned that it was an interesting moment in California specifically.
Yes.
And you worked with Cesar Chavez's group, which worked in local issues, state issues. So how what was that shift from Texas to California? How did you see it, or how did you experience that?
Well, Austin was a transitional time for me, because Austin has always been a very open society. Whatever hippie community existed in Texas was based in Austin, and so there was free thinking and free association on campus and off campus in Austin. So, as I said, when I went with one of my college roommates up to California and met her aunt, who was a professor at Stanford, we would dine at her home with her friends on the faculty, and the conversation was always broad and open and connected, and that's something that I had begun to experience in Austin. Never experienced it in Corpus Christi, but I had begun to experience it in Austin, and I wanted more of it. I mean, California was going in a very interesting direction, and I just wanted to go in that same direction. And I recognized that it had a lot to do with the program that I was in. Whether I got a job in journalism in California or went home to Texas, which is what I did, or even went to another part of the country like the Midwest or the East, which I eventually did. I wanted to be a part of the group that looked at things that were occurring and helped shape them And you do that in journalism. You help shape the conversations. And if you're working for a large organization like the New York Times, you're shaping thought in the rest of the world too. Not only about the United States, but also about things that are going on in their own countries and communities. And I wanted to be a part of that.
So to start this second section, I was going to ask, while you were at Stanford, did the issue of how Latinos got covered in the news come up? Was that something you and your peers paid attention to?
I don't remember specifically, although I know that anytime Felix and Jorge and I got together, we did talk about Hispanic issues. And I mean, you know, for one thing, I'm just remembering this, but for one thing, we would drive around California and assist Hispanics running for office for the first time. You know, we would help them with their promotional materials. We would counsel them on you know, how to address crowds, mixed crowds, and also Hispanic crowds, to explain the positions that they were taking about political issues and social issues that were then affecting California Hispanics. And so I'm sure in those conversations, all of these issues came up. I just don't specifically remember them, but I know if you talk to Felix and also to Jorge, they will confirm what I just told you, that we were involved in campaigns in the background. You know, we never appeared on stage or at mass rallies. We would meet them in quiet locations where we could talk to them about, you know, what it meant to conduct a campaign, a winning campaign.
So Dr. Felix Gutierrez and Dr. Jorge Chemet were also in these working with the United Farm Workers?
No, these were actually, well, I don't know actually if some of the people that we assisted in the field were associated with the farm workers. We did meet them in places like, you know, the artichoke fields where they worked. But no, these were people who were running for office, so they were citizens.
Oh, okay.
They weren't farm workers. But you know, when I worked as a volunteer with the farm workers in San Jose, we did talk to people about the importance of supporting political campaigns. I mean, they were not citizens, so they couldn't run for office. But we also talked to them about their rights and you know, issues that were impacting them.
Do you remember if these, the political candidates you were supporting, were these for partisan, non-partisan positions, or were they affiliated with
the party?
With a party.
It's been too long. Felix may remember, because he's the one who recruited us to go and you know, talk to them about how to run a political campaign, how to speak to crowds, especially mixed crowds. He'll probably remember.
And do you recall a particular candidate or a campaign that?
I don't. It's been too long. I think these were candidates for local offices, not statewide, not, you know, the legislature, for example.
So city, maybe
county. Yeah.
Okay, so once you finished the program at Stanford, so what was your first job, or what happened right after?
I went home to Corpus Christi and applied for a position at the local newspaper.
The Color Times.
Yes.
And so, what was it? What was it like, or what were you covering?
My first job there was in the women's news section, because that's where female reporters worked at that time in small papers in Texas. They joined the staff in the women's news sections. And, you know, you would take wedding announcements and engagement announcements, and in between you might be assigned to cover some social story, you know, involving high society in the town, or, you know, something related to women's interest, at what was thought to be women's interest at that time. But eventually, I was reassigned to be a music writer. I covered the music industry. Basically, I would cover concerts, and that was, I loved it. I had a great time. Remember, this was in. Let's see, when did I graduate from Stanford? It was in 19. I've forgotten. It was in the 70s, I think. It was in the 70s. At that time, Willie Nelson was popular in Texas. He was not popular all over the country and all over the world. But he was very popular in Corpus Christi. So when he came down for concerts in Corpus Christi, I would be sent to cover. And one day I showed up at this really raunchy bar where he was performing. I mean, this was way early in his career, basically. And he took one look at me and he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "From the Caller Times." And he said, "Okay, well, so you're going to sit up here on stage next to us, just off stage behind the curtain so that the audience can't see you, but you're not sitting out there." People were throwing beer bottles at the stage, and I mean, it was a very rough crowd. It was a late night, very rough crowd, and he just felt that he needed to protect me. So I sat on stage on the beer cooler and handed beers to Willie and his orchestra, his band, while they were singing. And I loved this. I thought, boy, they're paying me to do this. This is great, So in the future, when he was performing in Corpus, he would call me up at the newspaper and say, "Are you covering today?" And I would say yes. And he'd say, "Okay, we'll pick you up." And he would come down in his little silver Mercedes, which he had forever. And he and his friend, Bob, no, I can't think of his name, Paul, his best friend, would pick me up and drive me to the bar, and then to drive me back to the Caller Times when it was over. And I mean, I loved it. So I covered music for quite a while. I think almost the rest of the time under that current management. Then a new executive editor took over the paper, a man named Gregory Favre. And Gregory converted me into a news writer. From then on, I wrote news and some politics, but mainly general news. And I did that for 6 years, and then when Gregory left, he went to Chicago, to the Sun-Times. I went with the managing editor who moved to Florida. He went to be the managing editor of the Lakeland, Florida newspaper. And he hired me as an assistant metro editor, I think. So I would put out the first edition of the newspaper and then go home and hand it over to the next editor who put out the evening edition.
Okay, I'm taking a couple steps back to your first your stint at Corpus Christi.
Okay.
How did you feel about working on the women's news section?
I didn't really want to do it, but it was my first job. I was told, the woman who hired me, who became a lifelong friend, she was a mentor and a lifelong friend, said, everybody has to start somewhere. So do this. Take my advice and do this. And eventually, you'll move into another section. People move around in the newspaper business, and that's true. People always move around in newsrooms even though they start, writing music or writing women's news. They eventually end up in the news department, and that's what happened.
And speaking of mentors, who were your role models at the start of your career?
The woman who hired me at the Caller Times, Nancy Stanford was her name. And she and her husband became lifelong friends. In fact, I told you earlier that I've traveled quite a lot to France. Nancy and Paul, her husband, were both from very wealthy families. They just were in the news business because they enjoyed it. It was kind of a hobby for them in a way. Although they were serious journalists, they could have done many other things than that. But they eventually, when they left the news business years later, when Gregory left the Caller Times, instead of move to Chicago or go back into the go work for another newspaper, they essentially retired and they moved to France. They moved to Paris and lived in the city for 4 or 5 years. And then somehow they decided that they wanted to do something really different. And so they bought a cruise ship from City Services. The company used to ferry platform workers out into the North Sea on this. So it was a pretty big boat. It was a heavy boat. So they bought it in Holland, and they had it gutted and completely outfitted as an apartment. And it was a 2-bedroom yacht with a patio and back. It was a really nice. They did a really nice job on it. So then they left Paris. So they moved on to the boat and they moved to the canal system off the Rhone River in southwestern France. And while they were on the Canal du Midi, I used to go down and spend a month or 2 with them in the summers when I had enough time off at the Sun-Times. And we would just, boat around southern France. And I mean, it was a fascinating, and she really was like a surrogate mother. And Paul was like a brother to me. They're no longer living, but she was my mentor. And she had covered the civil rights movement as a young reporter before she went to work at the Caller-Times as a women's news editor. And so her stories just were inspiring to me. I knew that at some point I wanted to do some version of what Nancy had done in her career. She really did become a mentor in the most important way.
And you said earlier also that women were assigned to that section at first, at least. How many women work at the Caller-Times back then?
Not many, and most of them worked in the women's news section. There was one woman, the one woman who was the most well-known, had the highest profile at the paper, was the social editor. She had a column, and I mean, everybody wanted to be in her column. If they had a big party, they wanted it previewed in her column. They wanted her to talk about the guests at their party. And Corpus, by the way, was, there were many people who were important in the oil industry that lived there. So often there would be English politicians at these parties, that were old friends of theirs from the oil business. I met one of my first interviews in the women's news department was to interview the first Air Force general who was a woman, the first woman to be elevated to an Air Force general's position, and so I went out and interviewed her. I mean, it was not, and so that was part of the coverage of the women's news section. It wasn't all parties and engagements and weddings. And interesting that they sent a woman and not a male reporter to do that. I mean, she was an important person in the Air Force.
How about Latinos and Latinas in the newspaper?
There were in the community. There were people who were important socially. The Garcia family. We talked about Dr. Hector Garcia earlier. His sisters and brothers were politically important, and the Bonillas were politically important, and so they were routinely covered by the paper, and in a favorable way, because they were important. I mean, I think the white community saw them as windows on the Hispanic community. They were seen as very influential in the Hispanic community. So they were covered by the paper.
And in the newsroom, were there any Latina reporters, editors, or other?
There were a few. There weren't any. At the time that I joined the paper, I don't think there were any Hispanics who were editors. There were reporters, and they later became editors at the paper, much later, years later.
Was this, had there already been a history of Latino reporters at the paper, or was this an early?
At the time that I went there,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I mean there were reporters there who had been there for many years. I don't. I think one of them covered politics, local politics, and the others were general assignment reporters. So, if there was a huge oil spill in the harbor, for example, they might be assigned to cover that. They might be part of the team that covered that.
Okay, so at that point it was not exceptional in the sense of never having been any other Latino reporters before, or being the first one or the only one.
Oh yeah, no, I was far from being the first down there. I mean, there were veteran reporters on the staff when I went down there for the first time.
And how was it in Lakeland?
Lakeland was pretty interesting. Lakeland was an upper social organization, a city. I mean, the only Hispanics that I ever came in contact with when I worked there as a journalist were field workers, and illegal field workers. I mean, they were not American citizens. Farm workers, that picked the strawberries and the oranges, and I can't think of another journalist at the paper who is Latino. I don't think there were any. I think I was the only one. Yeah, I was the only one because, I think one of the early conversations I had with Gregory, not with Gregory, with Tim McGuire, who was my editor who hired me there. One of my earliest conversations with him had to do with whether I would be comfortable working in a newsroom that had no other Hispanics in it, and would I be comfortable in a community that was run by whites. The most important people in the community were whites, like, the owners of the grocery stores, chains, lived in Lakeland. And I remember telling him that, I had worked side by side with Anglos all my life. I mean, Corpus, at the Caller Times, it certainly was the case. I can't, except for Felix and Jorge at Stanford, all my friends and fellow students were Anglo-American. And really, and UT Austin, that was pretty true. At that time, it was overwhelmingly white. I had no trouble, by the way, directing the reporters and putting out the first edition of the paper. I had no resistance of any kind.
How did you already mentioned that the Latinos in this community were mostly people who work in physical labor?
Yes.
Were they part of the news? Were they covered? Did something happen at that moment that?
This is going back a long way. We had a reporter who was bureau chief in the town where many of the strawberry pickers lived, and he did cover them. I mean, he did write about labor, and we did run the stories. I just think they had mainly to do with the economics of the industry. I don't remember any social or political coverage associated with the workers. He did try to write stories at one time about the deplorable living conditions that the workers endured. I mean, shacks without heating or lighting, with blankets covering the windows sometimes. I mean, this was Florida, so mainly it was hot and humid. There wasn't a lot of terrible winter conditions. So he did try to write about that. And actually the reporters for larger papers like from Orlando and Miami also wrote series about living conditions of the workers in Central Florida. But that's pretty much all I can remember. I don't think we covered them regularly, not the politics of the people or anything other than the economics.
What part of Florida is Lakeland in?
It's in Central Florida, halfway between Tampa and Orlando. It's inland.
So was the community impacted much by Orlando or Tampa politics?
No, No, like I said, it was pretty much an upper middle class community, and you know, there was a very strong social character of the community. I don't remember a lot of overt political coverage at the paper.
So social character in what sense?
Um, it, it was a wealthy community, and the social atmosphere was very strong. There were big parties. There was a very well-known group of people who pretty much characterized the community. I mean, the community had their personalities. You know, George Jones and Tammy Wynette lived there for, while they were married, and were very important members of the social scene in Lakeland. It was that kind of a community. There weren't a lot of politics. I don't remember much of anything going on there other than social events.
So that was the bulk of
It was,
the news.
yeah.
How long did you spend at Lakeland?
About a year and a half, 16 months, something like that.
And what followed?
The Chicago Sun-Times.
So was that, I would imagine, was that a major shift?
Oh, it was a huge shift in my lifestyle, in my interests, and in my work. I mean, across the board. It was living in a big city. I'd never lived in a big city. I mean, even Palo Alto back then was a very small, sleepy little community. It was, I had an apartment on the river downtown, and so my neighbors were lifelong Chicagoans, and boy, after work, socially, for example, there was a very strong journalism community in Chicago. There was back then. We used to, after work at night, sometimes near midnight, all the reporters would convene at Billy Joe's at the Billy Goats. You remember that from Saturday Night Live. That was our bar. That was the Sun-Times bar, and Mike Royko would go, and Roger Ebert would go, and I mean, everybody would convene there and drink until early in the morning. It was a 4 o'clock bar. They had a 4 o'clock license, so you could stay there until almost you had to go to work the next morning if you were an early assignee. And that was new to me. The camaraderie that existed in the journalism community in Chicago was a revelation to me. I knew I wanted to stay in journalism when I moved to Chicago and worked in that environment. And we would talk about issues. And Jane Byrne's husband, the woman who later became the first mayor of Chicago, was a Sun-Times reporter, and he would go to the bars with us. And so, politics was always the topic of conversation, the first topic, but it would eventually get around to other things. But that to me was the cinch. I mean, I never wanted to leave journalism after that. Chicago was the place that made me a lifelong journalist.
What was your duty?
I went there as a copy editor, and after about a year, when I'd learned the city and learned the names and all the things that are important, you have to sort of develop an instinct about what's important to cover, and you do that by working on the copy desk and getting to know the players and the community and the issues. And so after about a year, they asked me if I wanted to become a reporter, and I jumped at it. I absolutely wanted to become a reporter. So my first assignment was to cover the ethnic communities, and in Chicago that meant the Jewish community, the Holocaust survivor community in a northern suburb of Chicago, and the Japanese community, people who had grown up, or whose parents had been confined to the internment camps during the Second World War. So those were my constituents. I mean, those are the people that I covered, and it was a fascinating thing. I mean, I learned about things that governments can do to people that I never would have imagined. I mean, I had no experience. I knew that the Hispanic community had never got its due. It had never been brought along by the Anglo community in Texas, but as far as my experience went, they had never endured what the Japanese and the Jewish, the Holocaust survivors had endured in Germany and in the U.S., in California. So it was an awakening for me too. I became much more interested in covering ethnic communities. I could write about Hispanic communities, but at that time the Hispanic community wasn't big enough to justify daily coverage in the editor's view. So I ended up, I did cover, mainly the communities that supported that kind of coverage.
Was anyone else covering the Latino communities, or what?
No. Only if there was a riot or something that would end up on the front page, then we would all get involved in covering it as a team. But it was rare. It really was rare. I don't, in Chicago, remember, there was a machine, a very strong one, until Jane Byrne was elected mayor. It ran the city. The aldermen, who were members of the machine, were not Hispanic and weren't particularly interested in bringing other ethnic groups into the apparatus, into the government. So there really wasn't an opportunity to cover the Latinos in the political sense.
Did anything like that happen while you were there? You mentioned rioting.
There were a couple of Spanish language newspapers, community newspapers, and they would write about the communities being unhappy with the lack of political presence in the system, and we would pick up when that seemed to be a serious contention, then we would pick up coverage like that, and the writers would go out and see what they could find out about it, and it would maybe end up as one or two stories, but it wasn't continuous. It wasn't, you didn't see a lot of coverage of Latino communities in the Sun-Times at that time. Later that became that changed.
Okay, but did you mention riots?
Unrest.
Okay.
Demonstrations there were not highly contentious takeovers, or there weren't a lot of injuries, or there was nothing like that. There might have been demonstrations that we would cover, and usually it was localized, like I'm trying to think of an issue that was starting to become important in Chicago at that time. Well, nothing comes to mind. But it was nothing of such significance that you would have read about it. That it would have been picked up by wires and covered by other newspapers in the country.
And so Chicago was certainly more diverse than Lakeland.
Oh yeah.
Was Chicago sometimes more diverse too?
No, I think I was the only Hispanic reporter there. In fact, I was one of only 2 Hispanic reporters in the whole city of Chicago. The Tribune had a reporter who was a kind of an intern, and he later became very important as a reporter, and I think also became an editor. This was long after I left Chicago. There had been a Hispanic reporter at the Sun-Times, now that I think of it, but he had not stayed long. He had left. I think he moved to New York. I'm not sure. He might have gone to work for the New York Times briefly. And I was hired on just as he left. I stayed longer. I think I was there 6 years. And I think he was only there a couple of years. He eventually went to work for a journalism organization that was involved in polling, political polling.
What's his name?
I knew you were going to ask that. I'll think of it. It's somebody that whose name you would have heard before.
And you also mentioned the Spanish language newspapers. Was there any contact with them, or with the publishers, or with the people who work there?
Any what?
Was there any sense of? You mentioned camaraderie, but were these publishers part of it?
Well, they were unified in their own neighborhoods, in their own environment. They were very critical of the way they were covered by the Sun-Times and the Tribune. And I'll tell you something that I've forgotten long ago. The Sun-Times decided to try to appeal to the Hispanic community, to try to get them involved in the coverage and to try to get them to read the newspaper. So they began publishing a tabloid insert called Los Vecinos. It was Spanish language, and they named me the editor of it. So I became the editor of this Spanish language newspaper published by the Sun-Times. You would have thought a bomb had been detonated in the city. They hated the idea. I don't think they liked the competition. They didn't like the Sun-Times publishing a paper that many Hispanic citizens might read before they read, the tabloids they were publishing. And we got all kinds of complaints from them. First of all, my two reporters were Cubans. They didn't like the Spanish language that we were using. They thought that we were publishing a Cuban newspaper, not an American American Spanish language newspaper, not a Mexican Spanish language newspaper. They were very angry about it. We never outlived that criticism. That newspaper was an experiment, and I think it died after a year because they just worked against it in the community as strongly as they could. And eventually it was killed, by us, not by them, but there was a lot of resistance based on issues that were hard for me to understand.
So these, so you were talking about the publishers of the existing
Yes.
Latino newspapers. So were they Mexican American or Puerto Rican? Or
They were Mexican American, and they resented the Cuban tinge of the Spanish that we were using in the paper. I mean, so what was I asked them at one meeting, we had a peace meeting at one point, and I asked them, what should I be doing? Should I be going through and re-editing their language to make it Mexican Spanish? I mean, what I understood to be Mexican Spanish. Remember, I'm from South Texas, and these are Chicago Mexican Americans. So we had different words for everyday objects. And their response was, as closely as I can remember, their response was that they just didn't want the newspaper to exist. They just thought we should give it up. They were answering the needs of the Hispanic community. The Chicago Sun-Times didn't need to step in and Bigfoot them. That was their response.
So just in general, I mean, this says a lot about the experience of editing the newspaper. How was it for you to do this type of work? So different from what you did before.
I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. For one thing, my reporters were bringing in stories that the English language paper wasn't covering. Oh, and by the way, I'll tell you another thing. We found we had resistance within the paper as well. There were many reporters and editors at the paper that did not want a Spanish language insert in the Chicago Sun-Times. One of them was Ann Landers. She was getting complaints from her readers and felt that we should rethink what we were doing. I mean, that wasn't well known, and the Sun-Times never owned up to it, but that was happening. I mean, there was resistance widespread in both the English-speaking communities and the Spanish-speaking communities for different reasons. The English language, because they felt like we were an English language newspaper, we had no business dabbling in Spanish language news coverage. And the Spanish community felt like, it wasn't their Spanish, and so it shouldn't be happening. They saw it as too Cuban.
So the complaints from inside, so that what reasoning would they give for saying that the newspaper had no business appealing to Spanish speakers?
You know, I don't think I know the answer to that. I think there's so many reasons that could be true. I don't know that the editors shared the concerns with me, frankly. They just said that, you know, there were complaints that this was not an. They didn't understand what the point was. I think that was the main question that the editors were getting, and finally the publisher killed it.
Just out of curiosity, the reporters that were working with you, were they hired for this, or were they left?
They were especially hired for this, yeah.
Did they stay afterward?
No, they both left. One of them now teaches in a program. I just saw, she just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times not too long ago. She went to teach at a school in California, social interest kinds of things. She was very involved in activist groups, and that's kind of what she's focusing on now. I'm not sure what happened to the other reporter. I think he probably went back to Florida. His parents were Cuban immigrants, and I think he just went back to, you know, to get involved in whatever journalism or other activities in Florida, Miami.
Well, this topic in itself is so interesting, that the story of Los Vecinos, that I could ask so many more questions about it. Like, just the last one, so before we move on to
Okay.
the rest of the agenda, but so you mentioned that you covered stories that were not covered by the rest of the newspaper, or the mainstream part of the newspaper. What type of stories were these?
Boy, it was the full range of coverage that any newspaper would cover of any community. You know, social issues, activism, lifestyle stories. You know, whatever bubbled to the top in the community in any of those areas was a potential story in Los Vecinos. I mean, it was a feature paper. It wasn't a newspaper, so there was quite a bit more to pay attention to than just the news. I mean, you know, if there was news being committed in the Hispanic communities in Chicago, it would be covered by the Sun-Times in English. That's not what our function was. You know, we were a social newspaper. We really wanted to characterize the community for our readers, and particularly our Spanish-speaking readers, our bilingual readers, and so that was the function. But even to me, that's very non-threatening. You know, it should be, but boy, it didn't come across that way. The publishers of Spanish language newspapers in the communities really resented it. They saw it as an incursion. And the one argument that they could make that could be heard by our publisher and editor was the fact that, you know, we weren't publishing the Spanish that they understood. It was Cuban Spanish. It wasn't Mexican Spanish or Puerto Rican Spanish. And there was a growing Puerto Rican community in Chicago at the time.
So you were at the Sun-Times, you said 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
What happened afterwards? Was that the move to the Wall Street Journal?
Mm-hmm. What happened was Rupert Murdoch bought the paper and installed a Scottish editor whose priorities and whose concept of news coverage was very different from mine. And I was number 50 on the staff to resign. 49 reporters before me resigned, and went. And you know, all the major news organizations in the country rented hotel rooms in Chicago and did interview after interview with all the reporters and editors who wanted to leave the Sun-Times after Murdoch bought the paper. I interviewed with the Wall Street Journal, and I was refused an interview with the New York Times. The editor who came down there to interview potential hires was the brother of the publisher of the Chicago Sun-Times. And he got word to me through his brother that that they were interested in me, but they had many other hires to make before they got to me. What that meant was, not you're terribly low on the list, but we have openings on our staff for political writers, social writers, et cetera, and we've been following the careers of people at the Sun-Times, and we think there's a fit between those reporters and the openings we have. But we will get to you. That's what they said. They didn't say when. So I got an immediate offer from the Wall Street Journal, from a woman who was from Texas and became another mentor. And she was the foreign editor of the Wall Street Journal. She needed a copy editor on her staff, and she made an offer. And at the time I thought, I don't know if I want to do financial coverage. I mean, to me, the Wall Street Journal did have a Washington bureau that focused on politics, but it was a long ride to get to that, a long road to get to that level. That was senior level stuff. And I just didn't know if I wanted to, so I thought, okay, I'll wait for the Times to come around. And if they don't come around in a couple of years or a year or so, then I'll do something else. But, she called me and said, look, you should come here, because there are no Hispanic reporters here. You would be unique on the staff, and that comes with certain benefits in a place like this. And I'll tell you a story about that later. But it was a very white newspaper. But so the next day, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her interviews of King Hussein of Jordan, who was the first Arab leader to break with the others and to talk about what could bring about peace in the Middle East. And that got her a Pulitzer. And so I thought, I think I want to work for this woman. I think this would be a great ride. So I called her up the next day and said, okay, Karen, I'm coming. And she said, okay, go downstairs, hand your apartment keys to the concierge, and get on a plane and come. I mean, literally, that's what she said. So I did what she said. I mean, I packed up things I wanted to take with me, and I went downstairs and gave my concierge the keys and said, a moving company's going to contact you. I'm moving to New York. And that night I was on a plane to New York, and when I got there, there was a residence hotel room on the Upper East Side, and I moved into it, and I went to work the next day. I mean, it was like a whirlwind. It was a way that I'd never seen newspapers operate. It was very flattering. So I went to work for Karen, had a great time. I ended up being, I was on, every new editor on the desk has to do night duty after about 6 months, when you've learned what the journal's coverage was. And so on my first night of night duty, I got a call from the government of Israel. They said, we're going to announce the first ever devaluation of the shekel tomorrow, and we want you to check our math to make sure that we're not getting it wrong, because we don't want the journal to disagree on what the valuation is now. So I did the math I had been trained to do by the journal. I mean, they put you through a very rigorous training program, and I did the math and said, yep, that's what I get. So they immediately put out a press release. I mean, where else do you get to do stuff like that except at a place like the Wall Street Journal? I was hooked. I thought this is the career I want for the rest of my journalism life, and I did have great times there. The day that I announced my resignation because I was going to the New York Times, so the Times called me and said, didn't we tell you to wait? And I said, yeah, you did, but I didn't know what that meant. I mean, and I couldn't work for Rupert Murdoch another minute. I was either going to wait for you or I was going to go to another paper. And they said, okay, so come now. So just come. And I said, I can't. I made a promise here, and I've begun to enjoy the work that I'm doing, and I've got a lot to learn, and I think this is a valuable place for me to be. And they said, okay, we'll give you a year. If in a year you won't come, then that's it. We're not going to ask you again. So a year later, they called me again and said, okay, now, how about now? And I said, look, why don't I come and take your editing test? I mean, you may not like me as an editor. And they said, okay, deal. So I went across town, I took an editing test, and they offered me a job that night. And I thought long and hard about this. I mean, it was a really tough move because I really enjoyed working with Karen. I loved working at the Journal. I loved what I was learning to do there. But in the end, I resigned and went to the Times. And so that was the first time. The day that I left, Karen put a note on the board, on the bulletin board in the foreign department saying, Norma Sosa, who's only been here for 2.5 years or 3 years or something, has just announced her resignation. Let's everybody wish her well. So this man comes up to me, somebody that I had seen walk every day. He passed my desk and went into the foreign editor's office and talked to her about what was going to be offered on the page in the page one meeting. That was like the last meeting before the page one meeting. And then he would walk by and he would smile at me and he would, walk away. Never stopped to say hello, never spoke to me, just smiled as he walked by my desk. So he comes over to me when he sees that note and he says, "Are you Norma Sosa?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I passed your desk every day. I had no idea that you came to us from Chicago. I used to work there." And he said, I wish I'd known. We would have had many conversations about the people that we probably know, and in common. And I said, "Well, why didn't you stop? You passed my desk every day." And he said, "Well, I wasn't sure you spoke English." I'm working on the foreign desk at the Wall Street Journal for 3 years, and he's not sure I speak English. I mean, that's how new Hispanics were to the Wall Street Journal when I went to work there. And he was a very nice man, by the way. He's a great guy.
So there was the move across town, like you said,
Yep.
to the Times.
Mm-hmm.
What year was this? Just to get a sense of the timeline. Early 80s?
It was 1990.
1990 when you moved to the Times.
Yes.
Okay, so.
Well, no, I'm sorry. Let me back up. I've been at the Times twice. The first time was 1987, I think. I went down to Corpus Christi, to my hometown, to be managing editor of the paper where I got my first job. And after a year and a half there, I left and went to the Times, and I was there for 10 more years. So it was 1990 when I went to the Times the second time.
Okay, so in any case, I got ahead of myself.
Okay.
So you were at the Wall Street Journal then when all the organizing started for what became
That's right.
NAHJ.
That's right. The organizing convention in Washington was after I resigned from the Wall Street Journal and before I joined, after I resigned from the Chicago Sun-Times and before I joined the Wall Street Journal.
That was the Washington conference?
Yes. Isn't that right? What year was the conference? Am I getting my dates confused?
87?
87. Okay, it was the Times. It was the Journal and the Times. I was in between those two jobs. Wait, let's see. I'm getting my dates confused. The Journal, when I was going to the Wall Street Journal, it was I want to say 89, something like that. And I was there for 3 years and then went to the Times for a year and a half or something, 18 months, and then went to Texas and then came back to the Times. And that was in 1990 for sure. Because when I left there, I'd been there for 10 years and I left in 2000. So that part of it's right. When I send you my resume, this will all make sense.
Yes. No, instead maybe we can trace the timeline for NAHJ.
Okay.
So at what point did you become involved in, I know there had already been conferences and meetings of Latino journalists.
Yes.
So at what point did you become involved in this particular group, this community?
The NHJ community?
Yes, what eventually became NHJ.
Well, Felix called me and said, there is a move to organize a national group for Hispanic journalists, a professional group. would you like to serve? I put your name forward, and everyone agrees we should have someone from the Midwest. And so I was in Chicago, and I said yes. So, but I also told him, look, there are changes afoot here at the Sun-Times. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be leaving here very soon. I don't know where I'm going. This is before I had had any conversations with Karen House. And before I had spoken to the Times recruiter, but like I said, they said, not now, soon, but not now. So I was in flight. I didn't know, I was in limbo. I didn't know what my next move was going to be. And he said, well, the thing is that there's a budget to fly you out here, so you don't really need an organization's support to do this. So whatever year it was that the first meeting was held, that was the year I got involved.
So these were already the meetings across the country to gather insights. Okay, so just out of curiosity, did you go to there was a big conference in San Diego in 1982 for Latino and Latina journalists?
Do you remember, what was the name of it? 'Cause I know we met in San Diego, but I don't know. I don't think that's what you're referring to.
Well, it was before NHJ existed.
Okay.
So it was put together by CCNMA and other, and there was an organizing committee from across the country because it was meant to be national, and I think that was part of the name, National Hispanic Journalists Convention or National Hispanic Media Conference.
I could very well have been there. I know that we did meet there because I remember at the time that Hispanic veterans of the Army veterans came to the group and said, can we be members? Can this be a pan-Hispanic organization? They said, oh, I'm sorry, but this is going to be a journalism organization. So but I'm thinking, I'm wondering if that was one of the organizational meetings that we held after the NHJ founding committee had been put together, or did it happen before that? I just can't remember.
Okay. So in any case, your more official involvement with the organization was when Dr. Gutierrez called you.
Yes.
So at that point you mentioned you were planning to leave the Sun-Times, but there was no offer from
any paper, yeah.
Okay, so you traveled to meet with them, and how did this go? What was your initial impression? What do you remember?
Of the NHJ formal? Well, initially I was in heaven. I mean, I was meeting Hispanic journalists from around the country that I had never met before, but whose bylines I recognized from national stories that were put out on the AP Wire, for example. I mean, I was thrilled. I liked my context. I mean, I was meeting people who were doing exactly what I was doing, had the same questions I had about our future and our contribution to the industry. So that was my overwhelming first impression of what we were going to be doing. But pretty quickly, I also felt like it was going to be a long, hard road. And not because there was any resistance from the outside, but because there was a very strong core group. It was all male, and it was mainly California-based, that wanted to drive it. They didn't want to listen to the views of other people, or they listened, but nothing came of your contribution, your ideas. And I wondered what we were going to end up with, what we were going to create, whether it was going to be useful for all journalists, not just male journalists. I really felt like there was almost an ethnic problem, because I mean, the term that was being thrown around a lot was macho. A lot of the women were saying, "Oh my God, did you hear that? Where did that come from?" And there was so much that was triggered that was unnecessary because someone in the group felt that he wasn't being given the proper reaction or admiration or approval You know, it really, for a while, you know, it was contentious. The meetings were contentious. And it wasn't based on, as I saw it, it wasn't based on the future of the organization, its mission, the role of Hispanics in covering, working for large news organizations in the country. There was something else going on. And in my conversations with other women, I mean, they felt the same way. There was one woman who was particularly exercised about it, Edith Auslander. I don't know if you've contacted her yet, but...
We will have an interview at the end of this week.
Good, good. She'll remember a lot of this.
So do you remember any specific proposal or idea that was dismissed in the middle of this environment that you mentioned?
You know, it was everything. It was what sort of an organization it should be, who the members should be, how it should be organized. You know, should only journalists belong to it? Should public affairs people belong to it? Should they have a role? What is a journalist? I mean, it really came down to that. In the end, we came up with different categories of membership, and we included people like Jay Rodriguez, who was in public affairs, who was in public relations for NBC. But I remember that being especially contentious. The California-based group wanted it to be just journalists, and the rest of us disagreed. We thought that, you know, there was a broader contribution to be made by all Hispanics in public affairs kinds of professions, including journalism, because journalism is a public affairs activity.
So was this more inclusive view, was it the majority view, or do you remember?
It ended up being, I mean, I think that's the direction that NHJ went, so I would have to say that if it wasn't the majority view in the beginning, it evolved into that.
And it was your view?
It was my view, and I believe it was the view of the other women in the group. I mean, I think you talk to Paula Maes, talk to Edie Auslander, talk to Maggie Rivas, you know, I remember too, there was a question about, you know, when I was saying earlier, what is a journalist? You know, Maria Elena was also a member of the group, and you know, she worked for not KMEX, right? And so there was actually a debate at one point. I don't know, I can't remember how long it went on, but there was actually a debate on whether Spanish language journalists should be full members of the group, or should they have a separate category, or should they have their own organization. And you know, Maria Elena felt very strongly that we were all one. We should be all one, and she's right. I mean, I think that's the view that the other women held. Maybe that was also gender-based as an argument. I don't know. I'm guessing that, because I don't know what was in the heads of the men who were arguing or raising the question. Maria Elena Salazar at that time was.
One thing that we were talking about earlier, the support of the employers of all the founding committee, how did they react to this, or how supportive were they? What was your experience?
Well, remember, I worked for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times during this whole organizational period, and they were strongly in favor of an organization like that. For one thing, they saw from the beginning that it would be an aid for them in attracting and hiring Hispanic language journalists, Spanish language and Hispanic journalists. And they knew that they needed them. They knew, you know, there were many issues that were bubbling up to the surface in most big American cities, and also in the rest of the world. And in Mexico, you know, they had a very strong bureau in Mexico City, both the Journal and the Times. And they were aware that it would be of enormous assistance for them to have a Spanish-speaking, native-born American Hispanic journalist working down there, who could interpret issues in important ways that white journalists could not.
So this was, for example, in the case of the coverage of Latin America or Mexico.
Yep.
And what about the domestic coverage?
Same.
So it would follow. So they were supportive of the time and resources that maybe sometimes you needed to devote to it.
They were. And as a matter of fact, the last, there was the last big thing that I remember at the time, the big initiative that I can remember at the Times was I was on a committee to organize one of the conventions. And so the Times funded travel and expenses to set up a committee that met in New York. And at that time, you know, we were working. It was one of the first joint conventions between Hispanics, Black journalists, and Asian journalists, and Native American journalists. So the Times organized this committee. It met at the Times. I was its chair, and we recruited Mohawks who came down from northern New York to sit in on it, and we came up with a lot of ideas on how to organize the convention, what its purpose should be, what its themes should be, what its overarching themes should be. I mean, it was really, and that was Times. I mean, that they stepped up and funded that. They felt it was very important. They wanted to see what came of a convention like that. They wanted to know what Native American journalists were interested in, what they saw as the main issues for their community.
So was this the unity?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And by the way, I mean, you know, any news organization should have seen it the very same way. I mean, you know, when the Times looked at this group, they were looking at the future and they knew it. And any news organization that wants to stay relevant in its coverage, that wants to cover important issues early on before they, you know, become contentious issues, should have supported that, should have seen that it was an important thing to do.
So in action and in what they said, they were supportive.
Yes. And they were very curious about what went on. I mean, they would send recruiting editors, and they would send all of the reporters who wanted to go to these things. And then when we all got back to New York, we would have conversations about, you know, what we thought we had just experienced and what was important, what were the takeaways. I mean, you know, they were very interested. I mean, I was really proud of them, frankly. And I hope other journalists were having the same experience with their news organizations.
Moving back a little bit to the formation of NASJ, you already alluded to the contentious nature of some of the meetings.
Mm-hmm.
As a representative of the Midwest, the East Coast, you know, areas that were not as close maybe to CCNMA and the existing infrastructure, how did do you remember this being an issue in the sense of journalists from the East Coast or from the Midwest, from Florida, not feeling included, or, you know, this being a...
I don't see it as being sectional in its origins. I think it was to some extent personality driven, and I think to a large extent it was gender driven. And you know, think back to the times when this was happening. You know, it was still a male dominated culture, and it was a male dominated profession still. So, you know, I don't fault the CCNMA members who essentially gave birth to this organization. And I certainly saw none of this behavior from Felix or from Jorge. But I think collectively it became an issue. I think, I really do believe that they fell into it. And it was a comfortable thing for them to have done, because given what was going on at the time. But it didn't make it easier to accept for the women who were also asked to take part in this exercise.
So was this, you mentioned that a lot of it was gender driven, was this actually discussed openly in those meetings?
We certainly discussed it over drinks after the meetings, the women on the group. And I remember Edie being particularly vocal in some of the meetings, in some of the open meetings. I don't remember her specifically saying, characterizing it openly as a male-female thing, but she was clearly reacting to issues that were misconstrued or misdirected or mischaracterized by the men who were driving it. And she was doing it in a very professional way, but it was clear what the underlying issue was.
Okay, well, let me try to look at okay, some of the most, you said one of the things that we discussed, how to define the membership and how to define who was a journalist. And this is kind of linked to the geographical divides, but how about the inclusion of, this attempt to be pan-Hispanic, pan-Latino, given the different demographics and the regional variations? How did the organizing, the founding committee, how did you try to balance the presence of Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans?
That was hard. That was maybe one of the hardest things we had to do, because the Mexicans felt that the Cubans were too political. They were mainly interested in the politics of Cuba and Florida, and we didn't see ourselves as a pressure group in that regard. We saw ourselves as a professional news organization. We just felt like the Cubans. Well, the group felt that the Cubans were too aggressive. The Puerto Ricans were heavily interested in northeastern issues. They all basically were residents of New York, and there were lots of hot political issues at the time that they were involved in, that they covered. Juan Gonzalez could talk about that at length. I mean, he would be good for you to talk to about that. And in fact, all of his books were not journalism books. They were political. They were first Puerto Rican books, and he also went down to Texas and interviewed Mexicans. I had the greatest phone call from him. We used to talk about the politics of our different sects, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, and I didn't feel like he completely understood what I was trying to tell him about us. That we felt like we were the founding Mexican society in the U.S. and that we saw everyone else as sort of new groups, and had not yet figured out how we would forge together into the future a new role for Hispanics in the country. And he felt like that was soft. He thought that was too soft. So he went down to Texas to write about Hispanics in Texas, right? He wrote a great book about it. He called me from Brownsville one night and said, "I completely understand what you were trying to tell me." He said, "I'm down here, and every time I had to do an interview with a Hispanic, with a Mexican American, I'm hearing your voice in my other ear." It was a great phone call. I mean, it said to me, this is what NAHJ in those years was missing. They weren't listening to other voices. They weren't hearing they weren't listening with that other ear. And I don't know. I've sort of fallen out. I went to the joint convention in Washington last year, but I hadn't been to a convention since in 10 years probably. So I don't have a real grasp on whether the groups are working closely better than they had been in the past. But I noticed that it was a more professionally oriented group. It was heavily. Its emphasis was heavily on job recruiting and moving minorities into higher and more responsible positions at all the news organizations. But I didn't get an ear for the politics that we used to grapple with.
So would you say it was much more political at the beginning?
Oh, very. Oh, yeah, very. Each group had its own. Each group thought that there was a potential for this to be a pressure group, not only in the industry, but politically. And I didn't want to see that happen. I didn't want it to be another political voice. I mean, you know, Raza Unida exists for that. NAACP exists for that. We needed to be a professional organization whose main goal was to get more Hispanics of every stripe, of every color, into the industry, and to be making decisions at the top.
Do you remember how, because this sounds like a very contentious, you know, the disagreements sound like they were very, very visible, very palpable. So how did you, the different groups or the different factions, soften all this during the meetings? What was the...
You know, at the heart of all of this organizing that we did, everybody wanted to see it succeed. And I think eventually, I think we all saw the commonality of that, of what we wanted the group to be. And that's what we ended up with. I think the Constitution that we wrote expresses that better than anything. I mean, we all came to an agreement eventually. And, you know, we didn't have shouting matches at the meeting. You know, if Edie didn't like what was being said, or if Maggie didn't like what was being said, or if I didn't like, then we would speak up. And usually I didn't think we got the ear that we needed to, you know, we didn't get the reaction that we were looking for. But after hours, we would talk over dinner. And, you know, eventually things righted themselves. I mean, nobody's views won out 100%, but what we ended up with was something that we could all accept. I mean, we kept our eye on the ball, I think, is what happened.
So, would you say you were satisfied with how the bylaws were written in the end?
For the most part, you know, I'm not going to remember the exact issue, but there was one issue that came up. Gerald Garcia was not on the group, but he was from Gannett. But he came to all our meetings, and he pushed something through in the bylaws that several of us had great concerns about. I'm trying to remember what it was. It had to do with who do we accept money from? Should we accept money from any group other than a news organization? And I think in our bylaws, we voted as a group with some dissensions. I was a dissenting voice. We voted to adopt his language, which opened the door to accept money from other organizations. You know, my fear, and I think other people who argued along with me that we should only take money from news organizations, is that eventually commercial organizations would come in and offer us a lot of money and then ask for favors, you know. And I didn't want to see that happen. I didn't want to see us become a sold or a bought group, you know. And I thought that the potential existed, not that it ever had come to happen, but I thought the potential was there.
Okay. So once the organization was officially created, we talked briefly about this before the interview. Did you become an officer? Did you run for one of the...
I actually, at a time when we were having trouble financially, and in part because I felt like we were spending money that we didn't have and we shouldn't, and we were funding things that we shouldn't fund, that we should have made a harder decision. I was talked into running for financial officer, which I did. And I did it for a year and then, you know, went out of the office because there were too many thoughts about how we should be spending our money, and I thought we were wasting it. My biggest issue, my biggest proposal to them was, let's stop running on contributed money. Let's stop asking the news organizations for money every year to fund these conventions, because, you know, they're going to get really bored with this if they don't see, you know, that this is going anywhere, that we're giving ourselves a better foundation. I said, you know, let's take the money that we've got this year and turn it into a foundation so that we can live off the interest. And that'll give us more stability, it'll give us more credibility. We can still take money contributions for convention organization from the news organizations, but we basically have indemnified ourselves from economic downturns when organizations don't want to give us the same amount of money they gave us the year before. Well, that went nowhere. I mean, I might as well have been talking to cats. Nobody saw the value of doing that, and it was never even taken up as a social as a real issue. So I went off after a year. I mean, I just felt like I've done what I could.
More or less, what year was this?
You know, you can find. I'm not going to remember, but you're going to be able to establish that by looking at the history of the officers of the organization, if NHJ has such a thing. I hope they do.
So, you mentioned also that you had some disagreements with how money was being spent.
Mm-hmm.
What was that? What specifically?
We were having conventions in big, expensive cities every year. And I saw the value of doing that maybe every other year. But, you know, they wanted to be in Washington every other year. Washington is horribly expensive. New York is horribly expensive. And news organizations were balking at sending all of their Hispanic and Black and Asian journalists who wanted to go because of the money that they would have had to put out for that. And so I kept saying, look, let's start meeting in smaller cities around the country, like Albuquerque or Dallas or some place that's going to draw journalists like the conventions will in Washington and New York, but that'll be less expensive, there's less of an outlay involved on our part, and we're asking the organizations for less money to help us fund a convention. And then coupled with that, I was saying, let's organize our finances so that we can live off the interest and not spend all the money that we take in every year.
So that these decisions were made by the board,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So why did they keep wanting to go back to Washington?
Because they felt it was necessary to show the flag in an important city where politicians are paying attention. And also, you have a better chance of drawing the president and the vice president, and I mean, the NABJ meets in Washington every other year, and last year, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton came to the convention. I mean, they're right about that, but my question is, can we afford it? They think it's necessary to keep the profile of the organization up, and maybe they're right. I mean, I think that's a real argument. I just don't know that we can afford it.
And speaking of venue choices, I forgot to ask. So, when choosing where to place a headquarters, what was your position? Did you have a?
My memory, I don't remember that I had a major role in that argument, but my memory is that I did think Washington was the proper place for us to have a home office because of the visibility. And I think that's been borne out. I mean, I do think that, any organization, any lobbying group, and I don't mean to say that we're a lobbying group, but any pressure group that doesn't have a Washington office, I think is easy to overlook. I don't think lawmakers see them as players.
And see, this is something I was thinking a couple minutes ago. So why would a journalist organization want to have the attention of lawmakers or the government, compared to, for example, getting the attention of the media industry?
I think they can do both in Washington. And I think, you know, it's important. Clearly, the White House thinks that the minority journalism organizations are important because they come. You know, the president comes. The candidates for president come. They realize that, I mean, they come to that group the way they come to any organization's convention. You know, the ASNE convention in Washington, they're always there. They spend, you know, half a day there talking to the editors about news coverage and issues. And that's, I think we want that the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and NABJ and the Asian journalists to be seen as places to discuss news issues and coverage from people to whom it matters, like office holders, like Congress, like, you know, the president. I think that's important.
Okay, so what has been your involvement in NAJ since then?
The only involvement that I've had with NAHJ in the last 10 years is that I went to the joint convention with the National Association of Black Journalists and Asian Journalists in Washington. This was last year, August, I think. And, you know, my eyes were opened. I really drank in a lot because I didn't know what had happened in the 10 years since I had been away from it. I was curious to see what the issues were, what the involvement of the organization was, and my impression is that it was heavily organized to elevate the recruiting. You know, there was a huge number of booths, many more than I remember from any previous joint convention, and there were and the recruiters were very active. They were going to all the receptions. They were handing out swag. You know, they were doing everything they could to increase their visibility with candidates that they considered choice attractions for their organizations. And I think that's good. I mean, I think that's what we all want to happen. But I didn't see the same kind of energy on the agenda when it came to political topics and social topics. I mean, I had a hard time picking things to go to. I ended up going to several conversations, panel discussions on which the contributors were all authors who had books recently published on related topics. And those were interesting, but you know, they really, I didn't see those as what I remember being the most valuable thing that we did when we organized our conventions. We had politicians, we had activists, we had organizers who gave us cutting edge conversations about issues and the future of those issues and what needed to be done to accomplish important things. And I didn't see a lot of that at this. And there was a lot of, you know, the two leading candidates for the presidency came, but the questions that were asked had to do with issues that are discussed every day, that were being discussed every day in those campaigns, and nothing that was said by them advanced the discussions even a little. I would rather have seen them talk about Hispanics and, you know, political and social issues and, you know, what they felt needed to be done or could be done, or whether anything could be done. I mean, I just don't know what's in their heads. I mean, you hear what they say at the stump on their campaign routes, but you don't hear them reacting to questions. You don't hear a lot of that, and getting their own traveling press to ask them questions on stage wasn't the same thing.
So, based on what you said about the questions posed to the candidates, do you think there's less emphasis on that Hispanic part of NAHJ?
I don't see it being as lively and as connected and as useful as I felt it was earlier. And maybe that has something to do with the issues that were prominent in before. Maybe it has to do with an evolution in society and politics that's taken place over the past 10 years. It's hard for me to say since I haven't been all that connected. I mean, I do watch news shows every day. I mean, I'm aware of what the conversations are. But since I'm not a working journalist anymore and I'm not out in the field asking questions and listening to crowds and hearing all of this go on firsthand, I tend to think that I'm missing the energy that I used to see in conversations nationally about Hispanics and Blacks and Asians and LGBT. And I guess I wonder if it exists anymore, if it's still current, if that's still happening. I hope it is.
So now that we're doing this comparison between back then and now, what would you say were the most effective contributions of NAHJ to the status of Latino journalists?
It brought panels together in an innovative way at the conventions to have conversations, and I hope that things came out of it. I mean, I remember panel discussions where politicians were sitting on a panel along with Dolores Huerta, talking about, you know, bringing things up to date on the workforce and who they were, what they were contributing, and what needed to be done to ensure the health of it, the growth of it, and if there were nationality issues, what could be done to address those, and to ensure that the future of the health of the agricultural community, for example, in California, when we had a California convention. Those things were happening. I didn't see that happening at the convention in Washington. It almost felt like people had moved on or were bored with the kind of conversations that we used to have, seeing it as the same old thing, maybe. I don't know. I mean, something happened. Something has happened over the last decade. I don't know what, since I haven't been closely involved.
Has the visibility of Latino and Latina journalists changed since then? Do you see more Latinos and Latinas on TV screens? Bylines?
I think the reports that are put out annually by NHJ and ABJ show that there's been an erosion, that at least in the growth, if not in the actual numbers. And I think that's borne out by what you see. I mean, I watch the news channels, MSNBC and CNN, and the BBC, by the way. And I frequently see more Hispanic surnamed reporters on the BBC covering British politics than I see on the American news channels. And that's, you know, a function of which day I turn it on and who's reporting. It could be that I'm missing the same kind of thing on MSNBC and CNN, but I just don't feel their presence, and I know that they're frequently on news talk shows. When I tune in, I will see a panel of white and Black journalists talking about Hispanic issues, and that to me is just criminal, because they're not getting firsthand what we all know is occurring out in the field, and they only know secondhand, really, or as reporters, but not with the understanding and the eyes that we could give to it.
Okay, and so kind of linked to the same question, do you think coverage about Latinos has improved?
I think you see more of it than you used to. I'm not sure that it couldn't be better if there were more Latinos reporting it. researching it, giving an understanding to it that cannot be given by definition by white and black journalists. In the same way that, if I saw black issues being covered by a white or a Hispanic reporter, I would question whether it was being developed as well as it could have been if a black journalist hadn't been a contributor or the main reporter. I just think that's something that has to be done. There's still a need for it, and I think that has gone away to some extent. I just don't see as many Hispanic reporters on television covering Hispanic issues. And there have been voting rights issues. I mean, there's just this recent court issue, the Supreme Court overturning a voting rule in Texas, and I think when it was reported by the Supreme Court reporter who is white, and the decision, I can understand the decision being reported by the reporter who best knows the Supreme Court and can give it the context that it needs to give. But then why not follow it up with a reporter out of Texas who is in touch with the Hispanic communities down there and can say whether it's even important to the Hispanic communities, and if it is, how so, and if it's not, why? I mean, to me that goes beyond context. That's giving it that's giving an understanding in our society that has been missing for a long time.
Going back to the organization itself, you recently attended one of their annual events. How has NASJ evolved through the years, from what you could see?
I think I don't know how this happened, and I could be overstating this because I haven't been following it closely, but I volunteered to shepherd speakers around at the convention, just to sort of help out, and because I didn't want to just be going to panel discussions the whole time I was in Washington, and I was steered to the executive director or the president of the organization. And it turned out that I was shocked when I was told who it was. I can't remember his name now, but it's the first non-journalist. He's actually part of, he works as a public affairs person with a large firm and is not a journalist and has no journalism background. And I just thought there's something wrong with this picture. I mean, maybe I don't blame him. I mean, obviously he's contributing. And that's to be commended. But I wonder what's happening in the organization that there isn't a reporter or an editor who could take the lead of the organization. Maybe there's an erosion in the numbers at the news organizations. Maybe they're not supporting it the way they used to. Maybe it's just a sheer number issue. I don't know. I'd like to know. I'd like to understand how this happened. And but this goes back. To excuse. I'm not trying to dump on the NHJ and what it's become. I guess where I'm coming from is that when we helped organize it, we saw it as an organization for journalists, and other categories of membership were included to give other people in the public affairs community a voice that we wanted to listen to, but it wasn't to give them the reins of the organization to lead journalism, to lead journalists, and maybe that's what's happening, and maybe that's I'm not a member anymore. I'm not involved in it anymore. Maybe that's where the membership wanted to go.
Why would it be important, in your view, why is it important to have a journalist, somebody who's active in the field or who has in the leadership position?
Because when the organization speaks to power, speaks to public officials, speaks to society about Hispanics, you want people in there who've been on the front line every day, who know what the issues are, who know the people who are affected by the issues and the laws and the lack of laws and the economic conditions. And I don't think that can be done by someone from the entertainment industry or a public affairs representative of a commercial organization. It's just, they don't bring the same thing to it in terms of experience and knowledge firsthand. I mean, they can read stories that are written by other people, but you know as well as I do, when you cover something, a fraction of what you found gets into the story because of space limitations, because of time limitations. But all of that you gathered forms the basis of your knowledge about what's going on out there. And that's nothing that can be brought to the table by people from the other categories of membership. Now they have other things to contribute. You know, they maybe a great sense of organization and how you speak to power in commercial organizations. I mean, there are things to be contributed. I just don't know that that's the leadership role for them. They can do it in other ways than leading a journalism organization.
Okay. So I'm going to do a jump back because there was something I wanted to ask you and didn't
Okay.
before. How, and this, you know, I can clarify what I'm talking about with activist, but how activist do you think the leadership of NAJ was early on, and has that changed from what you could see?
I think it varied with the officer, with the leadership. I know right out of the box when the NAHJ was organized, there was a good deal of activism in the leadership structure, and certainly on the board of directors. You know, Juanito Gonzalez, for example, was heavily involved, and you know what his issues are. You know, the Puerto Rican and the Mexican American issues in the country, and those bled into the organization of the conventions, the people who were put on panels, the structure of the panels, the themes of the panels, all of that. But like, you know, but jumping to the convention last year, the joint convention, I just didn't see that same thing. I really, and by the way, I really felt, and I don't mean this in a contentious way, it's more in a sorrowful way, that I felt that Hispanics and Asians were attending a black journalist convention. It was heavily, I mean, they're a much bigger organization. There are many more of them in the industry. So that's going to happen. That's just the natural course of events. But I kind of felt like the rest of us just got lost. And maybe that's why there were no issues of importance to us on those panels. I mean, I went to a couple of really interesting panels that I thoroughly enjoyed, like, you know, the social impact of black hair and how it's seen in society, and you know what people think when they see a woman with frizzy hair. You know, I was thoroughly entertained by that and learned a lot. I was very informed by it, but I didn't see comparable panels for Hispanic social issues or concerns, and how Hispanics are seen by society, and what determines how white society sees them. And it's maybe not their hair, maybe it is. I don't know. It wasn't brought up. I just kind of felt like we kind of got lost at that convention, and that was sorrowful to me, because I remember the conventions we had and how energetic they were and how much important things were said, and what I think came of them that was important.
Okay, so a couple of questions to close
Okay.
the interview to a close. And this is a little bit, I suppose we've addressed this in a couple of questions before, but What do you think are the main achievements of NEHJ?
I think they succeeded in making a place for Hispanics in journalism, in major journalism organizations especially. I think we demonstrated for major news organizations how important it was to have our view of things, to understand what the concerns and the experience of Hispanic populations in the U.S. are, and what their connections are internationally. Because, I mean, obviously, there's a strong connection between Mexican Americans and Mexicans. I mean, that's and same with Puerto Ricans and same with Cubans. And I don't think a lot of news organizations totally understood that before we started talking to them about it, organizing panels that had conversations that demonstrated how Cuban, native-born Cuban and at Cuban immigrant populations, how much interest they had in what was going on politically and socially in Cuba. I think they understand Hispanics much better than they ever have. Not, you know, it's an evolving thing. They need to understand better, and they need to understand where Hispanics are going socially and politically. And I think they realize that they can't cover those populations with white journalists and expect to capture everything they need to know about them.
On the other hand, has there been any unfulfilled potential, or have there been any disappointments with how NEHJ turned out?
I guess I was looking at the description of the next convention, NHJ convention. It's going to be in Anaheim, and I'm a little disappointed that it so far. I mean, it has yet to be finalized, but so far, I don't see an emphasis on professional concerns, and I mean, I guess the big question that remains on the table is why. I think some news organizations still need to talk to NHJ about why it's important to have more Hispanics and Hispanics in higher ranking positions who can direct coverage, not just perform it, and who can tell them what their concerns, what they're missing in the concerns that they bring up at their page one meetings every day. I mean, there's still a need for that, and I think with the fall in the numbers of Hispanic journalists in major news organizations, I think that's eroding.
And linked to this, and to close, I would like to ask you, based on your experience in the field and in organizing NEJ, what should be done to improve the status of Latinos and Latinas in journalism?
I think NHJ needs to focus on that more strongly. You know, I would love to see something like a convening, not a convention, but a convening of Latino journalists to talk about. Yeah, this is a great time to do it, by the way, in the wake of a presidential campaign where I think Latino concerns were largely ignored. I'd like to see a convening of Latino journalists to talk about, to sort of, what's the word, assess the campaign and the issues that were raised and not raised, and come up with a game plan for bringing those issues back to the fore. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how that would be accomplished. Whether it would be, you know, having conversations with executive editors and publishers about the erosion of Latino coverage and the overlooking of important issues, not just voting rights issues, but economic issues. And I mean, Latinos are surely going to be adversely affected by the changes in national health care because they form, a large portion of the poorest population of the country. And people who are not going to be able to afford and won't be able to do anything with tax breaks to buy health coverage. I mean, that's nothing for them. So why aren't these issues being discussed? Well, maybe in part because there aren't Latino journalists to raise that issue, or maybe because it isn't clear to executive editors and publishers that there are people looking for information about that. I mean, so what if a lot of journalists got together and, met in New York or Washington or Dallas or, somewhere convenient and assessed the coverage of the political campaigns and then came up with a paper that said, here's how we're falling short as an industry. And it's the wrong time for us to allow this to happen because the population's only growing. It's going to be the majority very soon. And it's going to be a very unhappy majority.
Sorry about that distraction. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the interview.
Welcome.
I just wanted to ask if there was, is there any other issue or any other event that I didn't bring up that you would like to mention?
Yeah, you were very thorough. I mean, we ended up, in the questions that you raised, we ended up talking a lot about the organization and the personalities, the founders, the issues. I think that was a pretty thorough job. If you think of anything that you want me to elaborate on, or if you think of new questions as you're going through the tape or your notes, I'm happy to to help.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure.